So welcome everyone. The presentation is about to begin. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes. Please keep your mic muted during the presentation and turn off web cameras. If you have a question or comment, please enter it in the chat during the presentation, and the presenter will address your question at the end. All 6 participants in today's event will have access to the recorded, or excuse me, all of you joining us today, and anyone who registered for the event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after this event. So, Natalia, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome everybody to our ICIS Intercultural Communication Interest Section Lightning Talk webinar entitled Emerging Trends in Intercultural Research. My name is Natalia Bereznikova. I'm the co-chair of ICIS, and I am happy to tell you a little bit about our section before we go into the main event. Next slide, please.
One moment.
So if you're joining us for the first time, I'm happy to tell you what is Intercultural Communication Intersection. We are an intersection of TESOL that addresses the ever-growing needs of language teachers who must engage in intercultural communication when they're teaching in their home countries or abroad. And as an intercultural communication intersection, we facilitate webinars, practice-focused or research-focused as the one you're attending today. We also host informal coffee hours where people can gather and meet colleagues all around the world. At the conference, we host academic panels. We also run Pecha Kucha and lightning talks like the one today. And we also publish regular newsletters issues. So please be engaged with us throughout the year and not just today. Next slide, please. There are many ways you can join us by attending events like that, but if you want to become a member of our ICIS, your first step would be to become the member of TESOL International, and then you can join us through my TESOL portal. We have over 1,000 members already. And on this portal, you will be able to see updates. You will be able to see calls for events like the one today, call for newsletter articles, and other things like that. We also have we also have a social media presence, and you saw some links in the slide. And before we go into the event today, I wanted to announce our upcoming webinar, which will be in November 17th, and will be very exciting. We have Dr. Joshua Gordon joining us, and he will be talking about issues in teaching pronunciation, intelligibility versus first language accents, and how it impacts the process of intercultural communication. So stay tuned for details on my TESOL or social media about how you can join this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And TESOL International Association's Intercultural Communication Interest Section is pleased to present this webinar titled Emerging Trends in Intercultural Research. Our speakers today are 6 current doctoral students from around the world. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Jennifer LaCroix. I'm the co-chair of the ICIS, and I will be your moderator for today's event along with Natalia. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have from Georgia, Nino Chachanidze. She's an invited EFL lecturer at the university and a current PhD doctoral student. We also have with us today Suyong Sarahan. She is also a PhD candidate in second language education at the Penn State University, signing in from Korea today. Third, we have Hamza Wubul, also a PhD candidate in the Department of Humanities and Education Sciences. Hazma is signing in today from Morocco. Fourth, we have Amanda Smaringen, a doctoral student in the second language education program in curriculum and instruction. Amanda is signing in today from Minnesota. Fifth, we have signing in from Vietnam, Tung Vu. Tung is a doctoral student at the University of Albany, but signing in from Vietnam. And finally, our sixth presenter is Michael Weinins, a doctoral candidate in linguistics and applied linguistics and a teaching associate. Welcome, everyone. Let us begin. Nino?
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Let me introduce myself. I am Nino Chachanidze. I have the teaching experience of 30 years at secondary and higher school levels. Nowadays, I'm a PhD student at Ilia State University, and I lead the TESOL affiliate in Georgia Country Center for English Teaching Excellence. My field of study is intercultural competency at EFL lessons and the textbooks. My aim is to analyze how information about American culture and Americans are delivered at the lessons by means of the textbooks on the example of Georgian public school in Rustavi. Next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. In my research, I asked the following questions. Does EFL learners have the tendency to stereotype Americans and America? For this purpose, I created a questionnaire investigating students' knowledge about American culture. And the second question is, does the EFL book EFL textbook cultural information about the USA coincide with students' understanding of America? Here I used a modified questionnaire to evaluate the American cultural material in the textbook. Next one, please. For the first stage, I evaluated the textbook New Inspirations 3, which was taught at EFL lessons in Georgia Country. And I found that the variety of cultures are represented in the textbook, the sources of which are original and authentic. They are sometimes used as the context for reading tasks and sometimes for speaking activities. The subjects covered in the textbook are specific to the target culture. As for an American culture, it is represented by means of cultural groups and only in one case by the social group. Also, it must be said that there is no American culture generalization facts. American cultural information is used without comments here. The learning material is given not only for a better understanding of the target culture, but also for its active, productive usage. Next slide. In the second stage, I surveyed the 64 ninth graders of public school in Rustavi, Georgia Country. Almost 86% of the respondents agreed that they got the partial information about America they need from textbooks. Just over 75 of those who surveyed agreed that they gained incomplete information from participating in the EFL lessons. More than 9% of learners consider that they don't get any resources associated with America, and only 4.7% of students think that they receive the complete information about America from books they study. From EFL lessons, just over 6% gain a complete and more than 17% no information from EFL lessons. Slide 5, please. So the findings of the textbook analysis suggest that in general, diverse cultures are offered from authentic sources. Mainly the subjects are specific to the target culture, presenting mostly cultural groups. There are no generalizations of the facts, and no subsequent commentaries about the American cultural information which is given for an active and productive involvement. However, it can be noted that a special cultural section dedicated to America does not exist in the units. The questionnaire results conducted among the 9th graders in Rustavi Public School indicate that students get a partial information about America from EFL textbooks and from the lessons as well. Consequently, they seek the other sources outside the classroom to satisfy their curiosity. For example, internet, family, friends, and street. Taken together, these results suggest that there is a need of EFL textbook analysis in Georgia country to discover the target culture representation rate. The conclusions may be important for the EFL practical teachers to make an action research concentrating on the EFL textbooks and their relevance to the learner's real understanding of the target American culture. I consider this research to be unique because it breaks the stereotypes that every licensed book is perfect and leaves the space for teachers to think out of the box. My advice for teachers is to be more flexible while locating the authentic cultural resources according to the target language, to make more teacher research and to make books more intercultural by considering action research outcomes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nino. Next speaker, please.
Hello,
Sarah?
everyone. My name is Soyeon Sarah Han, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the Pennsylvania State University in the United States. On behalf of my colleagues, Sung-Myung Yu and Yoon Chen-Yen, who are also here today, I'll be presenting a year-long study which we conducted together last year titled Exploring Interculturality Through Intercultural Collaboration. The study I'm presenting today comprised the pilot of my dissertation, which I'm currently working on. We conducted a study that focuses on how in-service EFL teachers' professional learning, particularly about their understanding of the concept of interculturality, develops in the midst of engaging in the dialogic transformative processes of intercultural collaboration that goes beyond national borders. Next slide, please. Our understanding of interculturality follows Dervin's model of proteophilic competences. Introduced as a new approach to intercultural competence and assessment in higher education, proteophilic competences is referred to as the appreciation of the diverse diversities. Arguing for the conceptualization of culture that goes beyond focusing on cultural differences and instead towards acknowledging its co-constructed and fluid nature in defining interculturality, Darwin argues that interculturality can only happen through interactions with another person, which has an influence on how we think, behave, perform, present ourselves, because one does not meet cultures but individuals. Interculturality therefore involves interaction and negotiation. Through this process, we can see beyond our culture and their culture and begin to realize that we may actually share a lot in common. As such, Darwin argues that starting critically and reflexively from similarities rather than differences can open up new doors for both research and practice in education. Next, please. A total of 4 EFL in-service teachers, 2 from Taiwan and 2 from Korea, participated in the study. From March until December, the teachers participated in weekly Zoom meetings with the 3 researchers who served as facilitators. The agenda for each meeting included discussions of readings on interculturality, development of the co-constructed intercultural project, and group reflection. While the meetings went on for a whole year, the second half was carried out in conjunction with the developed intercultural project in classrooms with the students from both countries forming mixed nationality groups. The images at the bottom of the slide are some of the screenshots from teachers and students' virtual intercultural activities. Multiple sources of data were collected, including video recordings of the meetings, interviews, and reflection notes that the team created together as a written form of dialogue. We use grounded content analysis to analyze the data. Next, please. What we have here on the slide are a few quotes from the interview we conducted with the teachers at the end of the PD. Our preliminary analysis shows that teachers' involvement in this experiential first-hand repertoire of intercultural collaboration allowed them to actively add to the collective knowledge and critically reflect on what it means to be a teacher promoting for intercultural language classroom. As teachers engaged in intercultural dialogue, they not only had a chance to re-examine their pre-existing assumptions, but were able to better understand one another by meeting the individuals and not cultures. They were able to see beyond the cultural differences and instead turn their attention to what is similar, which added to their developing positive relationship and a sense of connection. Echoing Dervin's emphasis on the importance of relationships in interaction, teachers came to learn the value of open-mindedness, patience, and respect when it comes to defining someone as interculturally competent. As one of the teachers reported, such lesson learned seemed to translate into their teaching practices as students too realized it's not that hard to communicate to build a relationship with someone outside of their country if they just open up their mind. Next, please. We expect our study to have implications for the existing knowledge base of intercultural communication research and intercultural professional learning of language teachers by demonstrating how teacher understanding of interculturality provided with appropriate PD opportunities can fundamentally shape how teachers approach intercultural teaching and learning and their language teaching thereof. We believe these efforts should include discussions around scholarly works on interculturality, involvement as part of intercultural intellectual community in communicating and negotiating with those beyond national boundaries, and space for critical reflection on the concept of interculturality and its role in English language teaching. In short, intercultural collaboration and engagement that is grounded in active participation, interaction, and reflection with one another can lead to development of more genuine and reflexive practices that support and cultivate language teacher intercultural learning. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Hello, I'm glad to be here with you guys. Well, I'm Hamza Abul. I'm a doctoral student at the Public University Bar in Spain. Today I'm going to present a brief summary of my doctoral research. So the title of my talk is Interculturality and English Language Education in the Global South, Possible Implication and Critical Insight. The first thing I want to start with is to define Global South. I mean, there's this difference between the Global South and the North. The Global South refers to those contexts and regions that do not really hold a central role in global affairs. I mean, the Global South is commonly considered as the regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Well, my PhD thesis is a thesis application, which means it's a combination of different studies centered around one central theme. Well, my PhD draws on principally TESOL and LT literature, also post-colonial studies, and also intercultural communication. Next, please. All right. Well, so the question here is how my talk directly relates to intercultural community research. Well, my PhD organized the colonial-like relation between the global north and south. So therefore, it specifically examines the dynamic understanding of English language teaching in the global south by critically interpreting, the influence of power relations and imbalanced intercultural communication. I mean, the key contribution of my doctoral research is its combination of different studies that examine several aspects of the intersection of interculturality, power imbalances, and the English language education in the global south. While the majority of the research was being conducted in Morocco, but still the linguistic dependency that characterizes the country's sociolinguistic situation, as well as its post-colonial positionality, renders this research findings relevant and pertinent and also applicable to other Islamic contexts that may have the same issues. Next, please. Well, as I mentioned before, this is a thesis publication. So so far I have 6 studies, 6 papers. 3 are theoretical and 3 are empirical. 4 studies have been already published and 2 are currently under review. So did I mention there? So I have the first one is reimagining the cultural dynamics in TESOL, culture and interculturality. This continues the work of Dervin, like scholars like Dervin and Holiday, where we're talking about the influence of native speakers on not only teachers but also students, because students feel this kind of pressure that to reflect the linguistic competence, they have to reflect also the cultural traits of I mean either the Americans or the British. The second one is intercultural communication dialectics in English language teaching. I mean, most of the research on intercultural communication is built on the differences other than similarities. So here dialectics discuss different differentialism that exists in the literature, how they can be considered taken into account while teaching English in with some sort of like intercultural framework. Then I have the one which is North-South imbalances in intercultural communication education. Here I'm advancing this kind of idea that intercultural communication is not about ensuring only the smooth function in the cultural encounters. I mean, it's not driven by a pragmatic concern, like developing intercultural competence or for business or now. Well, here it says that we have, as teachers, we have to consider the power imbalances that shape how people interact with each other. I mean, for example, the model of Byron is wide popular in TESOL and LT, but still, I argue it fails to consider how power imbalances play a major role in how intercultural communication is handled. Therefore, there's always this kind of like superiority to the global north and the south. I mean, it's called intercultural, but maybe it's not intercultural as we wish, because there's always this power imbalance between the global north and the south. Next, please. I failed to mention that the other three studies are empirical. One is always about the spread of vision in Morocco. When I have examined how university students perceive, English and also the culture, and also the student reflect this kind of like superior understanding and perception of the Anglophone cultures. Therefore, for them, speaking English somehow entails, enjoying the perks of the American and the British was not the case. So therefore, the American culture was reflected in their ideas, identities. So here I can say, like, when you learn a language, you also learn a significant part of it, like its culture as well. The other two studies have explored the beliefs and also the classroom practices of teachers, and I tried to examine to what extent teachers in Morocco they do reflect the literature on critical applied linguistic and power and blast teachings, and what are the findings, reported that teachers still advance this kind of simplistic understanding of the culturality and English language teaching. Therefore, they do not, they maybe implicitly, but they tend to favor Anglophone culture over their local perspective and culture. So here are the findings here. The first one is English is increasingly gaining more importance at the expense of local languages. I mean, English currently the global spread is everywhere, and there is this kind of like possibility that will take over not only local languages, all of the foreign languages that have been spoken in this place. So with globalization and globalized, Morocco linguistic dependency will be even accelerated because Morocco has been in a linguistic dependent French, but still with this momentum of the English, I think English may replace French in the future. This is the concern here for me is that favor Anglophone culture's English teaching classroom perpetuates power imbalance between the global north and south. So here, what I have tried to analyze is not only how English teaching is handled in Morocco, but linking to those post-coloniality and those studies, and they do really inform how we can handle our research in the global south. It's very interesting because post-colonial studies provides more, let's say, more nuance and more depth in discussing these things. Their foreign language practice has to submit this to politics of knowledge and power inequalities. Most of the research, most of the authoritative research on ALT and TESOL is produced, in the global north, in America or the UK. Before most of the teachers just take that theory and try to implement it in the context without taking into account, the local specificities, of their context. Next, please. Heritage application. This one I'm advocating for. So the reimaging of ALT stipulates resisting the coloniality of English. I mean, what I'm asking here is teacher develop a critical stance toward English. I mean, we do not really have to speak English and also reflect this culture in our students. I mean, I'm encouraging teachers, to enable the student to have access to English, but still maintain local identities, or even be develop this kind of like mid-awareness of how English may be influenced in the identity's perspective, because this even aggravate their local context, dependency on the others. So here is the need to interrogate foreign practices and theories that favor white Western thought. I mean, we do not always embrace, this all the literature or the knowledge coming from the rural north. We have to develop our own theories that take into account our specificities and also how we handle teaching. I mean, this is very important. There's a lot of work we have, like for scholars like Pedagogy, who they have been working with this, especially in the literature of critical bilinguistics. Final one is to promote analysis in which language is seen as a form of action in a specific place of time. I think it's very important to reconsider this kind of traditional understandings of the LD as being completely benign and good. I think we have to develop a critical reconsideration of how scholars of English have teaching may be influencing ourselves and individual self. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Amanda Smaringen, and I'm a doctoral student in second language education at the University of Minnesota. And I'm excited to be here because my research really explores the intersection of critical intercultural communication and language teacher education, particularly preparing pre-service English language teachers. And I'm really interested in understanding what happens when, like Hamza said, we bring the political back into these conversations of interculturality in terms of what it means to be an English language teacher, particularly when we're foregrounding issues of power, coloniality, neoliberalism, and culture reframed as a site of struggle from that critical perspective. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to be sharing a snippet of my dissertation work. And I want to thank the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition for their sponsorship of my work in this project. And my work really looks at preparing English language teachers who are critically conscious of their positions in the world as intercultural beings, as well as theorizing or understanding their willingness to theorize intercultural praxis in ways that are locally responsive and counter-hegemonic. And so my larger research looks at myself as teacher educator and really draws on these frameworks of critical cultural awareness, critical cultural responsibility, critical consciousness work, and critical race theories. And what I'm going to share today focuses specifically on critical whiteness studies within that scope. Next slide, please. So I'm sharing an ongoing analysis of my own pre-service teachers' course reflections during a course on intercultural communication and English language teaching that I've taught from a critical perspective. So we're looking at education in terms of reproduction of inequity, but also the possibilities for transformative change. And in these weekly reflections, I'm going to focus today on two particular cases and their reflections that were guided by the question, what identity, ideological, and emotional conflicts do pre-service teachers negotiate in their sense-making of critical reframings of interculturality and the field at large of English language teaching? Next slide, please. So I chose to focus on these two particular pre-service teachers, Grace and Holly, because they're both prototypical cases of subsets of pre-service teachers that I often see in my classroom. For Grace, she was a Spanish studies major, and she entered the classroom having had some conversations around criticality, race, inequity in terms of education. So she was somewhere kind of in the middle of her journey and discoveries, and she was really excited to learn a lot more. On the other hand, we have Holly, who was much further along in her development. She was a well-established polyglot, a linguistics major, and she had had very robust conversations prior to my course about race and linguistic justice. So what was interesting is even though they're in different spots in their journeys, they both reflected on essentially what they viewed as English language teaching from a critical perspective through these notions of harm and hope. So the biggest difference between Grace and Holly was how they viewed the connection between language and injustice through this lens of harm. So Grace was very much focused on her classroom, envisioning her future classroom, and the potential for harm within that classroom space. And she juxtaposed this with what she viewed as her future students' needs. And so she had this very multi-layered analysis going on. Her burgeoning awareness of criticality, and what she viewed as a complete lack of skills in carrying out work of criticality in her classroom, and how these often conflicted with student needs. And so she kept in this classroom space, and she never really figured out how to make any of these work. And so she had this newfound sense that classrooms aren't neutral, but she never really connected these to macro systems of oppression. And she couldn't figure out if she was a linguistic advocate or a linguistic colonizer. And so she, ultimately got stuck in her guilt and her white guilt of her nascent criticality, because she couldn't figure out how an individual teacher in an individual classroom could enact change at a systemic level. And so teaching for critical interculturality and English language teaching were for her somewhat incompatible at a large scale. On the other hand, we have Holly, again, very robust discussions, and she really centered harm at these macro level structures. And so for her, this linguistic imperialism, language loss, ethnocentrism were really the impetus of harm for her students. And because they were in this world, there's no choice for her but to engage in critical intercultural praxis in her classroom. It was non-negotiable. So for Grace, they were incompatible, but for Holly, they couldn't be separated, essentially, English language teaching and teaching with critical interculturality. The challenge with Holly is that she never really articulated what that looks like in terms of classroom practice. Next slide, please. So for me, what I'm interested in is how are we scaffolding reflexivity from where our student teachers are at, right? So for Grace, she needed to be directed more into conversations with macro structures, and Holly needed to be directed more into conversations with classroom praxis. And so for us as researchers and teacher educators, we need to figure out and be able to notice where our students are at and be able to scaffold their interactions in their sense making of critical interculturality. That's all I have. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with you.
Great, thank you. Next speaker.
Okay, so can you hear me? Sure, thank you. So thank you for your, thank you all my friends for your meaningful research. And I want to thank you all of my Vietnamese mates to come here and welcome and to listen to my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about one of my research about intercultural communication. As I believe, like intercultural communication is one of the hard topic to be researched. So I tend to use very simple English in order to help you understand about my research and to help my colleagues to understand about what I'm doing and why intercultural communication is very interesting to do. So today I'm going to talk about my research entitled Developing Capital in Language Learning and a mixed method study on Vietnamese English learners in the context of Vietnamese higher education. So my research is inspired by my overseas learning experiences in different countries. And I had a chance to travel to many countries. So I had so many opportunities in order to understand the varieties of English. I was able to understand why the English varieties are normally accepted in addition to the English language speakers in the inner circles. So next slide, please. So in terms of my research, I would like to talk about the context of this research. So broadly speaking, this research is located in the context of globalization. So what I mean is that, like, in addition to English language speakers in inner speaking countries like US, UK, or Canada, we are like gradually and increasingly accepting the varieties of English. So that's why I used to say like the English varieties are normally accepted. So that's why I don't necessarily reject the values and the meaning of English language speakers coming from different countries whose the first language are not English. In addition to that, I recognize that like the number of English language speakers coming from different countries whose first language is not English is more than the number of English language speakers who are considered like native speakers. So that's why we can come to our first conclusion is that we cannot ignore the contribution and ignore the values of English speakers who are not coming from the inner circles countries. And specifically in terms of my research, I would like to perceive the perspective of Purdue in 1986. He perceived the values of capital as an ultimate goal of English language learning. And according to Purdue in 1986, he classified the capital into 4 items involving economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, and the most importantly, I would like to pay more attention to the symbolic capital. So the first one is about economic capital. Like it is very easy for us to define economic capital, which means to be something related to money, or it can be transferred to money. About social capital, you can understand it as a way to broaden your social network or the relationship with other people in different communities or in different contexts. And the third one is about cultural capital. So this is very critical because I want to emphasize the role of cultural artifacts or cultural rules in different communities that shape directly or indirectly the behavior or the act of people in those communities. And the last one, which is about symbolic capital. So simply speaking, symbolic capital is defined as like to showing people of who they are and who they are in relation to others. So this is the one aspect that I want to have more attention in this research. So next slide, please. So like inspired by the context of this research, my research is about to investigate the how English language learning can enable the formation of different forms of capital for Vietnamese English learners in the context of Vietnamese higher education. So the first one, I would like to see how the economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital can be developed during the English language learning. And the last one is about how the symbolic capital can be connected or can be tied to the formation of other forms of capital. So in order to investigate my research and in order to answer the research question, I wanted to invite about 200 Vietnamese students in different universities coming to my research. And you can take a look at the right column and you can see the demographic of my participant. Next slide. So based on my research, and I have 2 aspects to be seen. So the first one is our statistical investigation. So like surprisingly, I can see that like cultural capital can be developed the most, and the social capital can be developed the least. So it left me a big room for me to do a lot of research in the future in order to see why it happened and why and what I could learn from that in order to expand our understanding. And the second thing is about the relationship between other 3 capitals and the symbolic capital. So from my statistical and qualitative research, I can see like the symbolic capital can be closely connected and positively correlated with other 3 forms of capital. So next slide. So coming to the conclusion of my study, I believe that like English language learning is closely tied to the formation of different forms of capital during in the context of higher education. So my conclusion is that if capital is gained through English language learning, it is fundamental that English language education in Vietnam becomes more engaging and for the Vietnamese English learners' professional prospects. So that's my research about ICC, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Weinins, and today I'm going to be talking about challenging past research for today's context. And it actually leads quite well from Tung's presentation, because we're going to be talking about those people in the world who speak many different varieties of English. Today, I'm going to kind of focus on the different topics of digital communication, globalization, and COVID-19. And then I'm kind of going to focus my talk around two particular articles that I published, one last year about email requests, and one this year that discusses Grammarly's tone detector. Next slide. So what I want to talk about first is this idea of emerging trends in intercultural research. So the internationalization of teacher and student populations, it has evolved the perceptions of pragmatic appropriateness. Also, the more digital correspondence that are happening, there's more digital correspondence happening, as well as online learning and interaction among all these different English varieties. And then lastly, COVID-19 has kind of accelerated this reality. And so the adoption and integration of internet into our lives has only increased. And Beisenbach-Lucas in 2007 kind of predicted this. She said that students entering universities in near and distant future will have grown up with much more exposure to the use of computer-mediated communication in numerous formats than their counterparts who entered universities only 5 or 10 years ago. Next slide. So the first one I want to talk about is the article that was published in Language Learning and Technology in 2020. And it focuses on email requests from two different populations, those that are learning English and those that have it as a first language. So ELX students, there were 25, and EL1 students who have it as a first language, 32 students. So I analyzed syntactic modifiers from the requests that they sent me via email. And then I used cross-cultural study of speech act realization coding framework in order to identify those. If you look at the top graphic, you can see that the black bars represent ELX students, while the gray bars represent EL1 students. And the use of syntactic modifiers was significantly less than the syntactic by ELX students, is significantly less than those of EL1 students. So even though EL1 students used syntactic modifiers for politeness to a greater extent, if you look at the bottom, perceived politeness, I had six teachers who teach composition and teach these populations of students go through and look at the request headaches and actually give a perception of politeness. And there were 6 different teachers that came from Kotru's 3 concentric circles. So I had 2 teachers from the inner circle, 2 teachers from the outer circle, and 2 teachers from the expanding circle. And if you look at the ELX pie chart, the light colors represent politeness and the dark colors are impoliteness. You can see that EL1 students actually have, so I see in the chat, EL1 is first English language first. It's their first language. ELX could be their second, third, fourth, whatever X represents. It's their additional language. So ELX students, English learners, were perceived as more polite, even though there was a lack of syntactic modification. So the question then becomes, not need the intervention to meet the pragmatic expectations of their professors. Next slide. So then we turn to another study I did in the Relic Journal, and this one deals with Grammarly's tone detector. Now, the tone detector itself helps students compose pragmatically appropriate texts, which could increase their confidence and autonomy. It also provides direct tone indications paired with an emoji. So it basically tells you what your email is sounding like based on natural language processing. So this particular tool is in perpetual beta. So it asks for user input to continually adapt and learn from the changing communicative situation. So if you looked at the top image is just some different emojis, but the bottom one, if you look, it said, here's how your text sounds. But then it asks a question, which tones did we get right? And it allows confident users, regardless of their language background, to then determine whether or not they think that the software got it right. Was it forceful? Was it gloomy? And to what extent? So the status of work in progress, or this perpetual beta, is a positive one because language is constantly evolving. So tools reflecting this reality take some time to respond. In the context of internationalization of institutions and transnational higher education where English medium instruction is employed, the tone detector provides a support system to students. So less confident students can compose texts that meet pragmatic expectations for appropriateness. And in this way, users can gain a sense of autonomy and confidence with the pragmatic feedback about their texts provided by real-time indications. Next slide. So what I want to focus on really for discussion is the idea of what I think are the emerging trends in intercultural communications rather than give the answer. There are a lot of areas of importance, but I would like to ask these particular questions in discussion. So to what extent is past research on intercultural communication that has a very different population, student and teacher population than is the reality today, is that still relevant for the context in which we teach language? Number two, how can we design inclusive studies that consider a wide range of language backgrounds for pragmatic research? And lastly, how has the digital and digitizing world that we live in, how has that affected intercultural communication and pragmatics? So those are the questions I would like you to think about in order to kind of project into the future the types of trends and the types of things that we'll be researching in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for listening. We have time for a Q&A. So Natalia, I'll hand it over to you, Natalia.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions that you have come up with while you were listening, now's the time to ask them. And you can also put them in the chat. I have been monitoring the chat and I haven't seen many questions, just congratulatory messages to each other. So I'll give a second if anybody has a question. All right, I'll break the ice. I'll ask the first question. Michael, I actually have a question for you, not because you were last, but this tone detector thing was very interesting to me, especially in the light of the two Hamza's and Amanda's presentation that really talked about the political and the critical aspect of intercultural communication. There has been a lot of discussion online about how women, for example, are encouraged to speak differently in the emails, or, there are all these tasks about how not to sound passive aggressive. And there was a lot of critique for that because it just really controls and polices women's language. So do you think there's any critique for this kind of tone software for students who are learning English, and especially in the light that English is an international language? And so, like, what norms of tone are there? So have you come across any of this type of discussions?
Yeah, so this is, because it is public software, I don't really have access to the back end. I did work with Grammarly a little bit on this particular study, but I don't have access to the backside of things. What I can tell you is that there's going to be obvious programmed in biases that just come from an environment in which colonial and imperial pasts kind of affect language, right? So those are going to be in there. However, I think that the fact that it is perpetual beta and that any competent user is allowed to give feedback, caveat, not that these aren't judged by the software as like who gets to actually put or give feedback. I'm sure that there's some correlation between your writing and who they implement that feedback from. However, it doesn't seem that they have a particular way other than really the language itself to be able to determine what sort of feedback gets built into the tone in the future, meaning that gender norms, racial norms, different English language norms, I feel are all moving towards a direction of kind of what I usually call the sphere of intelligibility, where there's kind of this modulation of the way in which language is used based on a wide world of language varieties, not just standard English. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's fantastic. And I think your clarification that this is like a constant work in progress certainly shows some promise for some counter narratives to be developed. And while we were speaking, there was another question also from Michael from Blanca. How can we train or teach both students and teachers to harness the affordances of tools like Grammarly for ELX students without turning these technologies into clutches or negatively affect the learning process? Thank you, Blanca.
I think that the importance so I'm in the TESOL Call IS, and one of the reasons I got involved with that is because I don't see in a lot of the TESOL master's programs a focused class that's on computer-assisted language learning. And I think that with that computer-assisted language learning education, that teachers really get to focus on the affordances of a certain piece of technology. And that's kind of like the overall thing that people always say when they're talking about call. But it's true, if you look at what is Grammarly good for, and not that Grammarly is the piece of technology that we're using. I'm not talking about Grammarly. I'm talking about the ability of software to give you feedback on pragmatics. And there's more than just Grammarly that can do that. It's the same with like Yahoo Messenger. There's some studies on Yahoo Messenger. Well, nobody uses Yahoo Messenger anymore. So now you can apply that to TikTok, for example, and look at the added affordances of multimodality and it being viral, things like that. So I want to say that specifically to focus on the affordances of a particular piece of technology is really the way forward.
Thank you. I think also it'd be very interesting to think about the predictive Google email predictive algorithms that really reduces a lot of critical thinking in writing and composing emails. Thank you. There's a question from Ramin Fatong. What does your initial research show you on what teachers in Vietnam should be doing with the teaching English and IC competence to prepare them for work?
Okay, so thank you, Ramin, for your question. Okay, so I just based on my research in order to answer the question. So based on the Vodou theory as my theoretical framework, I just want to add on the perspective that as a teacher of English, we should try to understand the different formation of capital among our English language learners in order to help them become more competent. As I just received a question just above. So being a competent English speakers means like we need to not only perform our linguistics units well, but also we need to understand how our language should be used appropriately and effectively in different communities of context where the English is properly used. So as a teacher, like it is advisable that we need to pay more attention to showing our English learners on how to use English differently, but very appropriately. Not just about showing them how to use grammar effectively, but need to show them how to understand and how to show empathy to different cultures. That is just one unique point in terms of my research.
Thank you. Michael, is that a question or a comment?
I was talking to Amanda. We were having a chat conversation.
All right, sorry. There is a question to Raul. From your research findings, how can we embrace more complex approaches to Interculturality in TESOL pedagogy?
I think while I was writing like my articles, it was hesitant to prepare with some sort of like all agreed upon framework to integrate criticality in the classroom. I think we have to always consider the context in which we are teaching English. I mean, I cannot just give like a very general understanding of what should be done, to address power imbalances. I mean, the situation in Morocco is still different from how it's in Eastern Europe because of the kind of language are spoken there and how, also the community. So I think my idea is that for teachers, they have to be aware of the kind of specificities of the context and also how English, the status of English in that context as well, and then show some sort of like a more profound understanding of what could be done. But I will be hesitant to provide like very clear-cut, applications and critical understanding. I think teachers should be careful how they are teaching and what kind of understanding they're delivering to their students. I mean, for example, when I was examining teachers' classroom practices, actually they were not aware of the fact they were, promoting the superiority of the Anglophone cultures and perspective. Because the main teaching methods, like when it comes to culture to culturality, was comparison. So whenever they compare, for example, American, the British culture, and Moroccan, it was always a favor the American and the British. So one thing I've learned that comparison would not really work. So we should not focus on differences, but still we have to be kind of careful how we teach and the kind of ideas we deliver to our students. I think this is something that has to be done in teacher training programs, because when I work here in Morocco, we don't really have any sort of course on intercultural communication. So teachers think that they only should prepare student for most of like the only thing that concerns interculturality in the classroom was teacher were focusing on the model of Byron, 1997, which considered knowledge, attitudes, and skills. I mean, that's very useful, but I'm afraid it does not really take into account, power imbalances between, the country. So I think they should know that. They should also be informed of the current literature on critical applied linguistics. I mean, scholars like Fred Durbin or Holiday also Pinnacle are really, really useful. I have answered this.
Yeah, and if I can just step in here and say something to this effect as well. This is a struggle that my kind of really defines my research is how are we preparing teachers for a critical approach to interculturality, right? And doing so in preparation programs when we start to think about being locally responsive becomes a complicated question when you have prospective teachers who are not quite familiar with the context in which they will be teaching in the future. And so the question then becomes not necessarily how do we prepare teachers to be locally responsive in their praxis, but how do we prepare teachers to have the tools and the ability to understand what local responsiveness means once they're on the ground in their classrooms. And so some of the things that I've been looking at that I think are tools that teachers can take into their classroom in order to understand the connections between the micro, the meso, and the macro scales, and framing students as a source of knowledge, essentially, where it's not just the teacher that's bringing criticality in the classroom, but the classroom itself as reflecting a sort of microcosm of these larger realities, and students are fully capable of navigating those. I've been looking at using participatory action research as a pedagogy, critical discourse analysis as a pedagogy. Community building is super important. And one of the more interesting things I think I've been working with my pre-service teachers with is on modeling the messy thinking of coming to criticality, right? So a lot of times when we're preparing teachers, they view their teacher educators as these sort of wholly intact gurus on social justice and inequity, because we've been through several years of reflecting on this, and our research is part of that. But it's not straightforward, it's not linear. And so, we talk a lot about real world events, and I model my thinking and my initial biases that emerge in my thinking and how I'm counteracting those biases in how I'm thinking, and really modeling the unfinishedness of the whole process of this, right? So that's kind of what I've been working with in my own classrooms and my own preparation of pre-service teachers. So I'm not sure if that gives us some tools to think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic comment, Amanda. And there's definitely, as we often see in this type of events, there's a lot of synergy that's happening between, a lot of your presentations, and that what makes this so beautiful, that there's this emerging research, there's definitely a wave coming in. So we're very excited to see what you guys are gonna do with your research going forward. And I would like to bring your attention to the chat. There are many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time and we don't have time to address all of them. So please save the questions, please stay in touch. And if you have any more interest in our intersection or presenting with us or for publishing your work in our newsletters, we're very happy to have you. And so thank you everybody for being here with us today.
Great, thank you. And with that, we conclude today's online program. This recording will be available to you within the next week from TESOL, and it will be entitled Emerging Trends in Intercultural Research. So stay on the lookout for that. And a special thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you so much for being here today.